Normandy, France, July 1944. 3 weeks after D-Day, the Allied forces were consolidating their positions while facing fierce German resistance. American forward aid stations, set up just a few kilometers from the front lines, worked under constant bombardment to stabilize the wounded before sending them on to field hospitals. His hands trembled, but never stopped. Dr. Thomas Greer knew that every second lost to hesitation cost an American life. Beside him, Evelyn Carter held a blood-soaked dressing while the Normandy sky exploded in orange flashes. It was July 1944, and the American combat medics endured relentless bombardment to keep alive the hope of thousands of wounded soldiers. Sergeant Frank Dawson lay motionless on the improvised stretcher, watching those angels in stained coats defy death itself. In that tent ripped open by shrapnel, war revealed its rawest face. Those who heal also bleed. Dawn came with the distant roar of German artillery, and Thomas Greer couldn't tell whether the tremor in his hands came from the Norman chill or from the fear gnawing at his resolve. 3 weeks had passed since D-Day had broken the Atlantic defenses, but victory still felt like a distant promise when he looked at the mangled bodies arriving without end at the forward aid station. The smell of ether mixed with the metallic tang of blood created an air almost impossible to breathe, each inhalation a reminder that the line between life and death was thinner than the suture thread in his hands. Thomas adjusted the stethoscope around his neck and moved among the improvised cots, knowing his medical skill would be tested not only by the complexity of the wounds, but by his ability to stay calm as bombs fell only meters away. War had turned his calling to heal into an act of sheer resistance, where saving a life meant defying the very logic of destruction. Every patient stabilized was a small victory against chaos, a fragment of humanity preserved in the midst of barbarity. The young Chicago doctor had never imagined that his diploma would become a weapon against death on occupied French soil. Fingers trained for delicate stitches in silent hospitals now had to work with surgical precision, while the ground shook from German shells. Battlefield medicine allowed no hesitation, and Thomas had learned that genuine compassion demanded physical courage as much as technical knowledge. Evelyn Carter watched the American doctor with a mix of admiration and concern, recognizing in him the same determination that had carried her from London to that shredded tent in France. The British nurse had volunteered to work with American medical units because she believed nationality meant nothing when it came to saving lives. Yet she discovered that the universal language of medicine took on different accents when spoken under bombardment. Her hands, once accustomed to the meticulous procedures of London hospitals, now improvised bandages from pieces of uniform and dispensed precious morphine, as though each dose were liquid gold. Her blonde hair, once neatly tied during shifts at St. Bartholomew's, now fell in rebellious strands she had no time to tame between emergency surgeries. Evelyn had learned that war turned even the simplest gestures into acts of silent heroism. Holding the hand of a dying soldier, while shrapnel ripped through the tent demanded a courage no nursing manual could teach. She discovered in herself a strength she hadn't known, a capacity to function at peak efficiency, while her heart broke with every lost life. Her blue eyes, once reflecting only the calm of hospital corridors, now carried the intensity of someone who had faced death and chosen to fight it. The British accent that whispered words of comfort in English mingled with the broken French she used to soothe wounded civilians, creating a strange melody of international hope. Evelyn knew that every soldier saved would carry with him the memory of a nurse who risked everything to give him another chance to see home again. Sergeant Frank Dawson drifted between consciousness and the morphine-induced haze, but his soldier's mind stayed alert enough to grasp that he was witnessing something extraordinary. The grenade fragment that had torn through his abdomen condemned him to enforced stillness, turning him into a privileged observer of the coordinated dance between life and death unfolding around him. Frank had led men across blood-soaked beaches and mined fields. He knew intimately the sound courage makes when it confronts fear. Yet he had never seen bravery as quiet as that of the doctors and nurses working tirelessly under enemy fire. The coarse texture of the military canvas against his wounded skin reminded him he was far from the wheat fields of Iowa, but the medical team's unshakable dedication made him feel that America was present in that French tent through the compassion of her children. He watched Dr. Greer's hands move with surgical precision as German bombs exploded close enough to make the operating table tremble, and he understood he was witnessing a kind of heroism rarely honored with medals. Frank knew that if he survived, he would carry forever the image of Evelyn Carter gently wiping blood from his face with a tenderness that stood in stark contrast to the violence surrounding them. The veteran soldier recognized that these medics fought a different war, one where every victory meant returning a man to his family, and every loss meant a letter an officer would have to write to a grieving mother. The morphine dulled his physical pain, but sharpened his emotional awareness, letting him see nuances of courage that direct combat had never revealed. Frank Dawson was learning that there are many ways to serve one's country, and some require surgical instruments instead of rifles. The morning's first bombardment came with the telltale whistle of German grenades slicing through the Norman air, a sound Thomas had learned to identify with deadly accuracy in recent days. The impact shook the ground violently, toppling surgical instruments and sending the wounded into panicked screams, but neither he nor Evelyn paused in the chest procedure they were performing. The concentration required to keep his hands steady while death exploded around them demanded a mental discipline no medical school taught, a capacity to create pockets of calm within absolute chaos. The acrid smell of gunpowder mingled with the sweet, cloying odor of ether, forming a sensory signature of that particular war against death. Thomas felt a hot metal fragment zip past his left ear, but his hands continued stitching with the same precision he would use in a Chicago operating room, knowing that to hesitate would mean losing the soldier whose life depended on him. War had taught him that true medicine happens when one practices the impossible under impossible conditions, when you save a life knowing your own could be taken in the next second. Evelyn held the lantern that illuminated the surgical field, and Thomas noticed that her hands remained perfectly steady, despite the terror she must have felt. The silent partnership they had developed worked with the precision of clockwork, each movement of one perfectly complementing the other's actions. In that moment, the American doctor understood that war forges professional bonds that transcend nationality, hospital protocol, and even the fear of death itself. From his cot, Frank Dawson watched that symphony of medical competence under fire and thought he was witnessing a form of courage purer than any cavalry charge. The second explosion came closer, tearing a gash in the tense canvas and letting the gray light of the Norman dawn blend with the yellow glow of kerosene lamps. Thomas felt hot shrapnel strike his back, piercing the white coat already stained with the blood of dozens of soldiers, but his hands kept working, for stopping that suture would mean condemning a young man from Nebraska to die far from home. The doctor knew every second stolen by fear cost American lives, and that awareness worked like an anesthetic against his own terror, a psychological morphine that kept him functioning beyond normal human limits. Evelyn adjusted the lantern to compensate for the new opening in the tent, and Thomas realized she had developed the same ability to adapt instantly to ever-changing circumstances that defined the best wartime surgeons. The British nurse wiped the blood trickling from a small cut on her forehead, caused by a splinter of wood torn from the tent's frame, but never shifted her focus from the procedure she was assisting. Frank Dawson watched this display of professionalism under extreme pressure and understood he was witnessing the kind of heroism that rarely appears in military reports, a courage exercised with instruments of healing instead of weapons of destruction. The wounded sergeant realized these medics were fighting a parallel war, where every victory meant returning a soldier to his family, and every defeat meant more than a military casualty. It meant the irretrievable loss of personal stories, interrupted dreams, and futures cut short. The rough texture of the bandages against his injured skin reminded him constantly of life's fragility, but the medical team's unbreakable determination made him believe that humanity possessed reserves of resilience even war could not exhaust. Thomas finished the suture with the same precision he would in peacetime, and Frank Dawson understood he had just witnessed a miracle disguised as a routine medical procedure. War showed its cruelest face through destruction, but revealed its noblest dimension through those who devoted themselves to rebuilding what the bombs had shattered. When death strikes in waves, medicine answers with precision, each suture a declaration of war against chaos. The morning advanced with the inexorable persistence of a crimson tide, bringing new wounded by the minute, and Thomas Greer discovered that his physical limits could stretch indefinitely when necessity demanded it. The forward aid station, set up in an old French school whose walls still bore bomb-scarred children's drawings, had become a nerve center where life and death fought for territory with the ferocity of warring armies. The smell of disinfectant mingled with the sweet, sickly odor of coagulated blood, creating an atmosphere too familiar to ignore, yet still intolerable enough to remind everyone that this was anything but normal. Thomas tightened the tourniquet on the left arm of a soldier from the 29th Infantry Division and realized his hands had developed a muscle memory for procedures that once required conscious focus. War was turning him into a different kind of doctor, one who practiced medicine with the urgency of a fighter and the precision of a watchmaker, where every wasted movement could cost an American life. Evelyn prepared morphine syringes with the efficiency of a production line, but Thomas noticed how she studied each wounded face, with the personal attention of someone who understood that behind every injury lay an interrupted story. The American doctor had learned to read the British nurse's expressions as an emotional barometer of the situation's true severity. When Evelyn's brows knit just slightly, it meant the next case would be difficult. Frank Dawson, still immobilized on his stretcher, watched that medical choreography with the fascination of someone discovering that war contained dimensions of heroism military manuals could never adequately capture. Evelyn Carter moved among the wounded with the fluid grace of a dancer who knows the music by heart, but the melody guiding her steps was composed of soldiers' groans and the distant whistle of German artillery. The British nurse had discovered that genuine compassion worked as an analgesic more effective than morphine when delivered with the right measure of hope and professional skill. Her hands, trained in the orderly hospitals of London, now improvised solutions with materials she had never imagined using for medical procedures. Pieces of uniform turned into bandages, military belts adapted as tourniquets, canteen water sterilized over the flame of a lighter. Evelyn had learned that war respected no hospital protocols. It demanded medical creativity no manual could teach, a capacity to transform any available object into an instrument of healing. Her blonde hair, once impeccably arranged during her shifts at St. Bartholomew's, was now tied back in whatever way allowed her to work without obstructing her view, because personal vanity had become irrelevant when lives depended on her efficiency. The young woman had discovered in herself a physical endurance she hadn't known, an ability to function at peak precision even when fatigue threatened to dull her reflexes. Thomas watched her prepare dressings with the same meticulousness she would bring to an elective surgery, and understood that Evelyn had turned the war into an extension of her medical vocation instead of allowing the violence to corrupt her dedication to healing. Frank Dawson noticed that the nurse's voice maintained the same calm, reassuring tone one might use to comfort a frightened child, no matter how severe the wound she was treating. War revealed the true character of people, and Evelyn Carter was proving that her essential nature remained unshaken, even as bombs exploded close enough to make the surgical instruments tremble. Frank Dawson drifted in a state of consciousness altered by morphine and blood loss, yet his military experience allowed him to assess the medical team's competence with the precision of a trained observer. The sergeant had led men through life-and-death situations, knew intimately the signs that distinguish seasoned professionals from dangerous improvisers, and recognized that Thomas and Evelyn operated with a level of excellence that transcended their adverse circumstances. The rough texture of the army blanket against his wounded skin kept him tethered to physical reality, preventing pain and medication from completely severing his awareness of what was happening around him. Frank watched Dr. Greer's hands move with the same precision a sniper uses when adjusting his sight, except that the goal here was to preserve life, not end it. The veteran soldier understood he was witnessing a form of warfare tactical manuals never adequately described, a battle in which surgical instruments replaced weapons and the enemy was death itself. The morphine dulled his physical pain but sharpened his emotional perception, allowing him to catch nuances of devotion that direct combat rarely let him see so clearly. Frank knew that if he survived his wound, he would forever carry the memory of how true medicine works when practiced by people willing to risk their own lives to save strangers. The sergeant from Iowa had learned throughout his military career that courage takes many forms, but he had never witnessed bravery as silent as that of the doctors working under constant bombardment. War was teaching him that authentic heroism often unfolds far from the spotlight, performed by people whose only reward is the quiet satisfaction of sending wounded soldiers back to their families. Frank Dawson watched that symphony of medical competence and thought he was witnessing the noblest side of humanity. The mid-morning bombardment struck with an intensity that made the ground shake as though the very French earth were being torn apart, and Thomas felt that this time the Germans had calibrated their range perfectly to hit the aid station. The first explosion toppled shelves of medical supplies, scattering surgical instruments across a floor already littered with debris and creating a metallic cacophony that mingled with the screams of panicked wounded. Thomas and Evelyn exchanged a look that spoke volumes without words. Both knew that stopping the ongoing procedures would mean losing soldiers who still had a real chance to survive. The American doctor continued suturing the abdominal wound of a young corporal from Texas, while Evelyn administered blood plasma to a soldier who had lost a dangerous amount of blood during transport. The acrid stench of German gunpowder mingled with the medicinal odor of ether, creating a sensory signature that had become the hallmark of this particular war against death. From his immobile position, Frank Dawson watched that display of professionalism under extreme pressure, and understood he was witnessing something that transcended medical protocols or military duty. The sergeant realized that Thomas and Evelyn had developed a form of nonverbal communication that worked flawlessly even amid chaos. A raised eyebrow signaled the need for more gauze, a nod requested an adjustment in the lighting, a pointed glance indicated treatment priority. The second explosion was close enough to shatter the remaining windows of the old school, but neither of the two medics hesitated in their procedures. Thomas finished the suture with the same precision he would in a quiet operating room, and Frank Dawson understood he had just witnessed a medical victory fought on ground, contested inch by inch with death. The third explosion opened a crater only a few meters from the aid station's entrance, sending earth and debris through the broken windows and coating everything with a fine layer of Normandy dust that mixed with the blood of the wounded. Thomas felt a hot fragment scrape his right shoulder, tearing through the white coat already stained with evidence of a morning spent saving lives under enemy fire. The doctor ignored the superficial burn and continued working on a soldier whose left leg had been shredded by an anti-personnel mine, knowing that every second of hesitation increased the chance of amputation. Evelyn adjusted the lantern to counter the dust that obscured their view, and Thomas realized she had developed reflexes that anticipated his needs before he could voice them. The British nurse wiped the blood from a small cut on her face, caused by a flying shard of glass, but never diverted her attention from the procedure she was assisting. Frank Dawson watched that medical choreography performed under bombardment and thought he was witnessing a form of performance art where technical precision and physical courage combined to create something that transcended both. The wounded soldier understood that Thomas and Evelyn were fighting a different war, one where every victory meant returning a man to his family, and every defeat represented a personal story cut short forever. The coarse texture of the improvised dressings against his wounded skin reminded him constantly of the fragility of human life, but the team's unshakable determination made him believe in the endurance of the human spirit. Thomas placed the final stitch with the same precision he would in peacetime, and Frank Dawson knew he had just witnessed a miracle disguised as an emergency medical procedure. War showed its most destructive face through German bombs, but revealed its most constructive dimension through those who devoted their lives to repairing what violence had shattered. Medical courage is not measured by the absence of fear, but by the surgical precision maintained while bombs explode all around. The afternoon arrived bearing more wounded than the morning had produced, and Thomas Greer discovered that there are reserves of physical energy only extreme circumstances can access. The forward aid station now ran with the frantic intensity of a wartime factory, where every wasted second meant a lost American life, and every successful procedure represented a small victory against the German machine of destruction. The smell of ether, mixed with the metallic tang of blood, had intensified over the hours, creating an atmosphere that made lungs burn and eyes water. Yet everyone had learned to ignore it, because stopping to breathe fresh air meant abandoning soldiers who depended on their skill. Thomas adjusted the position of a makeshift surgical lamp over a young soldier from the 1st Division who had lost a great deal of blood in transport, and realized his hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer physical exhaustion accumulated over 18 straight hours of emergency surgery. The war was testing not only his medical competence, but his endurance as a human being, forcing him to discover how many consecutive hours a doctor can operate before fatigue starts to compromise his ability to save lives. Evelyn prepared morphine syringes with automatic movements that betrayed the same exhaustion, yet Thomas noticed she checked each dosage with the same meticulous care she would apply under normal conditions. The American doctor understood that both of them had long since surpassed the limits they once thought possible, keeping themselves going through a combination of adrenaline, a sense of duty, and the desperate need the wounded soldiers had for their skills. From his cot, Frank Dawson recognized the signs of extreme fatigue, but also saw that neither Thomas nor Evelyn would allow exhaustion to compromise the quality of their work. Evelyn Carter felt the weight of the last 24 hours in every muscle of her body, yet she had discovered that genuine compassion worked like a fuel that could be endlessly renewed through contact with others suffering. The British nurse had learned that there are emotional reserves only life or death situations can mobilize, a capacity to keep functioning even when the body begs for rest and the mind pleads for a pause from relentless intensity. Her hands, trembling slightly from exhaustion, still held the precision needed to thread needles into collapsed veins and dress complex wounds, because she had discovered that true medical competence does not depend on ideal physical conditions. Evelyn watched Thomas work with the same unshakable determination he had shown since morning, and understood that both of them were being sustained by something that transcended bodily energy, a strength born from the awareness that every life saved justified any personal sacrifice. Her blonde hair, now completely disheveled and matted with sweat, framed a face etched with accumulated strain, yet her blue eyes kept the same compassionate intensity that characterized her peacetime work. The young woman knew she was operating beyond her normal limits, in a territory where medicine became a form of resistance against forces intent on destroying human life. Frank Dawson noticed that Evelyn constantly checked on the condition of every wounded man under her care, even while occupied with other procedures, displaying a multifocal attention the war had cultivated in her. The British nurse had become a kind of silent guardian, who kept constant watch over all the wounded, as though each one were her personal responsibility. Thomas perceived that Evelyn had developed a sharpened medical intuition that allowed her to anticipate complications before they appeared clinically, an ability only the intensive experience of war could teach. Frank Dawson drifted between states of consciousness altered by morphine and blood loss, yet his soldier's mind remained alert enough to understand he was witnessing a demonstration of professional dedication that transcended any description military regulations could offer. The sergeant watched Thomas and Evelyn work with a synchronization bordering on telepathy, anticipating one another's needs before they were voiced, moving around the wounded as if they shared the same strategic mind, adapted for medical ends rather than military ones. The rough texture of bandages against his wounded skin kept him anchored to physical reality, preventing the medication from carrying him into a state of unconsciousness that would make him miss that extraordinary display of competence under extreme pressure. Frank knew he had led men through situations where death was a constant possibility, but he had never seen a form of courage as quiet as that of doctors who risked their own lives to save those of strangers. The seasoned soldier recognized that Thomas and Evelyn were fighting a parallel war, where every victory had a first and last name, and every defeat meant a family receiving an official letter mourning the loss of a son, husband, or father. The morphine sharpened his emotional perception, even as it eased his physical pain, allowing him to catch nuances of devotion that would escape notice under normal circumstances. Frank Dawson understood he was witnessing authentic heroism, practiced by people whose only reward would be the quiet satisfaction of returning wounded soldiers to their families. The sergeant from Iowa had learned over his military career that there are many ways to serve one's country, but he had discovered that some of the noblest involve instruments of healing rather than weapons of destruction. The war was revealing to him dimensions of human nature that tactical manuals could not capture, aspects of courage that manifested through compassion, applied under impossible conditions. The afternoon bombardment struck with an intensity that made the walls of the old French school tremble as if they were made of paper, and Thomas realized the German gunners had finally calculated the exact range to hit the aid station with deadly precision. The first explosion was close enough to shatter the few panes of glass still intact, sending fragments slicing through the air like miniature projectiles and forcing everyone to duck instinctively. Thomas, in the middle of suturing a chest wound on a corporal from North Carolina, had to choose between protecting himself and continuing the procedure that might save an American life, and his hands stayed steady on the surgical instruments. Evelyn, administering plasma to a soldier who had lost a dangerous amount of blood, kept the needle in place even as wooden splinters torn from the ceiling whistled past her head. The acrid stench of German powder invaded the medical space, mingling with the familiar odor of disinfectant, and creating a scent that had become the hallmark of that particular war between life and death. From his cot, Frank Dawson watched that display of medical professionalism under direct fire and thought he was witnessing a form of heroism history books rarely record with due weight. The wounded soldier understood that Thomas and Evelyn had turned medicine into a declaration of war against the forces that sought to destroy human life, a silent resistance carried out through technical competence, applied under conditions that would test any human being's limits. The second explosion was even closer, opening a fissure in the east wall and allowing the gray light of the Norman afternoon to blend with the yellow glow of kerosene lamps. Thomas felt hot fragments strike his back, piercing the coat already stained with the blood of dozens of soldiers. But he finished the suture with the same precision he would bring to a quiet operating room. Evelyn adjusted the plasma bottle's position to compensate for the new opening in the structure, demonstrating the same instant adaptability that characterized the best wartime medical professionals. The third explosion turned what remained of the west wall into rubble, covering everything with a layer of dust and debris that mixed with the wounded's blood and formed a gray paste that clung to all surfaces. Thomas wiped blood from a small cut on his forehead caused by flying debris, but his focus remained fixed on the soldier whose life hung in the balance on his operating table. The American doctor had learned to create bubbles of absolute concentration, even as the world literally exploded around him, an ability medical school could not teach, because only the direct experience of saving lives under bombardment could develop it. Evelyn continued monitoring the vital signs of 3 soldiers simultaneously, demonstrating a multifocal attention the war had forged in her, through the constant need to keep every wounded man under medical watch. The British nurse had discovered that true compassion requires not only technical knowledge, but the physical courage to apply that knowledge when bombs are exploding close enough to make surgical instruments rattle on their trays. Immobilized yet conscious, Frank Dawson watched that symphony of medical dedication performed under enemy fire, and understood he was witnessing something that transcended hospital protocols or military obligations. A pure demonstration of what human beings are capable of when their highest instincts are mobilized by extreme circumstances. The sergeant knew that Thomas and Evelyn were risking their own lives to save strangers, and that this choice placed them in a special category of heroism that rarely receives proper recognition. The rough texture of dressings against his wounded skin reminded him of the fragility of human life, but the team's unshakable determination made him believe in the infinite resilience of the human spirit when motivated by authentic compassion. Thomas placed the final stitch while blast dust was still drifting down from the damaged ceiling, and Frank Dawson knew he had just witnessed a medical miracle won on ground, contested inch by inch with German death. True medical heroism happens when you save a life, knowing your own could be taken in the next second. It is medicine practiced on the frontier between life and eternity. Night fell over Normandy like a heavy curtain of smoke, and the distant echo of bombardments that seemed never to end, as Thomas Greer discovered that darkness heightened both the danger and the intimacy of that medical battle against death. The forward post now worked by the glow of kerosene lamps and field lanterns that cast flickering circles of yellow light, turning every surgical procedure into a dramatic performance where shadows danced across the bomb-scarred walls of the old French school. The smell of kerosene mixed with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid aroma of German gunpowder had become the olfactory signature of a night that would test the extreme limits of human endurance in the practice of wartime medicine. Thomas adjusted a lantern over a soldier from the 82nd Airborne, whose abdominal wound demanded immediate suturing, and realized that his hands had developed a tactile sensitivity that compensated for the poor light. His fingers could identify tissue and locate blood vessels by touch, with the same precision his eyes would have provided under normal conditions. War was shaping him into a different kind of doctor, someone who practiced the art of healing through all his senses, adapting to impossible circumstances with the flexibility of a survivor and the precision of an artist. Evelyn prepared surgical instruments by the trembling light of a candle shielded by glass, and Thomas noticed she too had developed the ability to work efficiently even when visibility was limited and the sounds of battle created a constant soundtrack of destruction. Frank Dawson, drifting between consciousness and the morphine-induced haze, felt that the darkness had sharpened his hearing, allowing him to catch vocal nuances that revealed the true emotional state of Thomas and Evelyn as they worked under crushing pressure. The wounded soldier understood he was witnessing medicine practiced in its purest and most demanding form, where technical skill and physical courage fused into something greater than both. Evelyn Carter had discovered that the Norman night carried an almost intimate quality that stood in dramatic contrast to the violence filling it, as if the darkness created a private space where compassion could operate with deeper, emotional intensity. The British nurse now worked guided mainly by touch and medical intuition, her hands moving among the wounded with the confidence of someone who had memorized the geography of human suffering through hard experience. Evelyn had learned that darkness amplified both fear and courage, forcing her to trust professional instincts planted during her training, but fully developed only through practice under extreme conditions. Her blonde hair, damp with sweat and stuck to a face speckled with dust and blood, framed eyes that had adapted to the gloom and could catch details that normal lighting would never reveal. The young woman knew she was working in a realm where medicine became a form of performance art, executed under conditions that would test the sanity of any ordinary person. Yet she had discovered in herself reserves of endurance she hadn't known she possessed. Thomas watched Evelyn administer morphine to a softly groaning soldier and noticed that she whispered words of comfort in English blended with fragmented French, creating a soothing melody that served as emotional anesthesia, alongside the chemical relief of pain. The nurse had developed the ability to be fully present for each wounded soldier, even while tending to multiple cases at once, as if she could multiply her attention without diminishing its intensity. Frank Dawson noted that Evelyn's voice maintained the same maternal, reassuring tone one might use to calm a frightened child, regardless of how grave the wound or how close the German explosions. War was revealing the young nurse's true character, proving that her compassionate nature remained unshaken, even when bombs exploded close enough to make medicine bottles rattle on the makeshift shelves. Frank Dawson floated in a state of consciousness that mixed physical pain, chemical relief, and a strange mental clarity, allowing him to observe the scene with the objectivity of a theater critic watching a performance about life and death. The sergeant had spent the entire day immobilized on that cot, transformed into a privileged witness to a demonstration of medical competence beyond anything he had encountered in his years of military service. The rough texture of the army blanket against his wounded skin kept him grounded in physical reality, preventing the morphine from carrying him into unconsciousness and robbing him of the chance to witness authentic heroism performed without audience or recognition. Frank understood that Thomas and Evelyn were fighting a different war, where the weapons were surgical instruments, and the goal was to preserve life rather than take it. Yet the intensity of the combat was equally fierce, and the personal risks equally deadly. The experienced soldier recognized that medical courage required a special kind of bravery, the ability to keep one's hands steady and mind clear while bombs exploded nearby, knowing that a single technical mistake could cost the life of an American who might otherwise be saved. The morphine sharpened his emotional perception even as it eased his pain, allowing him to notice details he might otherwise have missed, like the way Thomas repeatedly checked each patient's pulse, even while focused on other procedures. Frank Dawson knew he was witnessing something official military reports could never capture: the human dimension of war, where victory was measured in lives saved rather than territories taken. The sergeant from Iowa had learned that there are many ways to serve one's country, and some of the noblest take place far from the front lines, carried out by people whose heroism is expressed through compassion under conditions that would test the limits of any human being. War was teaching him that true courage often works in silence, performed by individuals whose only reward is the quiet knowledge that they returned wounded soldiers to their families. The night bombardment came with a ferocity that turned the Norman darkness into a deadly fireworks display, where orange flashes of explosions alternated with the smoky gloom that invaded the medical post. Thomas felt that this time the Germans had perfectly coordinated their artillery to target medical facilities, a strategy that violated the laws of war, but had become common on the Norman front. The first explosion was close enough to make the entire structure of the old school shudder violently, toppling surgical instruments and sending the already shocked wounded into fresh panic. Thomas was performing an emergency tracheotomy on a soldier from the 4th Division, whose airway had been damaged by shrapnel, and understood that to stop would mean losing a young man with a wife and 2 children waiting for him in Ohio. The American doctor kept working with the same precision he would bring to a silent operating room, while Evelyn held the lantern that lit the surgical field, despite the debris falling constantly from the bomb-damaged ceiling. The acrid smell of German powder mixed with the medicinal scent of antiseptic, creating an odor all too familiar, yet still frightening enough to remind everyone that death prowled constantly in that space dedicated to preserving life. Frank Dawson watched that display of medical professionalism under direct fire and thought he was witnessing a form of resistance. Military manuals could never properly classify. A war fought with scalpels instead of rifles, where every victory meant sending a soldier home to his family. The second explosion opened a crater in the schoolyard, hurling earth and metal fragments through the shattered windows and covering everything with a layer of dust that mingled with the blood of the wounded. Thomas felt a hot shard cut a shallow gash across his left forearm, but his hands remained perfectly steady because he knew the soldier depended on his technical skill to survive the critical minutes ahead. The third blast was the closest yet, collapsing part of the roof and creating an opening through which the flickering light of German flames mixed with the yellow glow of the still-burning kerosene lamps. Thomas completed the tracheotomy successfully, and the sound of the soldier's breathing, restored to normal, was almost lost in the roar of explosions, yet it marked a medical victory won inch by inch against German death. Evelyn immediately repositioned the lantern for the next case, a young sergeant from Louisiana, whose chest wound demanded immediate surgical attention, demonstrating the seamless transition between procedures that defined the best wartime medical professionals. The British nurse had developed an efficiency that bordered on choreography, anticipating Thomas's needs before he voiced them and keeping constant watch over all the wounded at once. From his cot, Frank Dawson observed that symphony of medical competence performed under bombardment and understood he was witnessing authentic heroism, the ability to function with technical excellence while one's own life is constantly at risk. The wounded soldier realized that Thomas and Evelyn had turned medicine into a declaration of war against the forces determined to destroy human life, a silent resistance carried out through compassion under impossible conditions. The rough texture of the dressings against his wounded skin reminded him of the fragility of the human condition, but the team's unshakable determination made him believe in the infinite capacity of the human spirit to endure the worst circumstances through devotion to higher ideals. Thomas began the next procedure while fragments still rained from the damaged ceiling, and Frank Dawson knew he had just witnessed medicine practiced in its purest, most demanding form, where each suture was a victory over chaos, and every life saved a testament that humanity possesses resources of resilience that even war cannot exhaust. In the darkness of war, the light of medicine shines brightest. Each life saved is a candle lit against the night that threatens to consume the world. Dawn of the second day arrived without Thomas Greer or Evelyn Carter having slept even an hour, and both discovered that the human body holds reserves of energy that only life or death situations can fully mobilize. The forward aid station now ran with the frantic intensity of a large-scale rescue operation, where every minute wasted cost American lives, and every successful procedure was a victory wrested from the jaws of German death. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the sweet, cloying odor of coagulated blood had intensified through the night, creating an atmosphere that made lungs burn, but that everyone had learned to ignore. Because stopping to breathe fresh air meant abandoning soldiers who desperately depended on their medical skill. Thomas adjusted the position of a surgical lamp over a young lieutenant from the 101st Airborne, whose multiple injuries demanded an approach that would test the limits of his medical experience, and he realized his hands had developed a steadiness that transcended accumulated physical exhaustion. The war was revealing capacities he hadn't known he possessed, turning him into a kind of doctor who practiced the art of healing through sheer force of will when all conventional resources were spent. Evelyn prepared morphine syringes with movements that had become automatic, yet Thomas noticed she still checked each dosage with the same meticulous care she would apply under ideal circumstances, proving that genuine professional competence does not depend on favorable conditions. The American doctor understood that both of them were being sustained by something beyond bodily energy, a strength born of the absolute awareness that every life saved justified any personal sacrifice the situation demanded. From his cot, Frank Dawson recognized the signs of extreme exhaustion, but also saw that neither Thomas nor Evelyn would allow fatigue to compromise the precision of their medical procedures. The war was teaching the wounded sergeant that some forms of heroism operate in silence, practiced by people whose only recognition is the quiet gratitude of soldiers who will return alive to their families. Evelyn Carter felt every muscle fiber in her body protest the continuous effort, yet she had discovered that genuine compassion worked like a renewable fuel that could be replenished indefinitely through direct contact with human suffering calling for help. The British nurse now worked in a state of almost meditative focus, her awareness divided among multiple patients at once, without losing the intensity of attention each individual case required. Evelyn had learned that wartime medicine demands a special form of mental presence, the ability to be completely available to each wounded soldier, while maintaining constant vigilance over all the others, who also depend on her professional care. Her blonde hair, now completely disheveled and matted with sweat mixed with blast dust, framed a face that reflected the accumulated strain of 36 uninterrupted hours of work under constant bombardment. The young woman knew she was operating far beyond her normal physical limits, in a realm where nursing became a form of performance art, executed under conditions that would test anyone's sanity in ordinary circumstances. Thomas watched Evelyn deliver palliative care to a soldier whose injuries were too severe to allow realistic hope of recovery, and realized she gave the same full measure of dedication she offered to cases with favorable prognoses. The nurse had developed the ability to compartmentalize her work emotionally without losing the essential humanity that made her presence comforting to soldiers facing the real possibility of death. Frank Dawson noticed that Evelyn whispered personalized words of encouragement to each wounded man, showing that she had memorized personal details about dozens of soldiers, even amid the operational chaos surrounding them. The war was revealing the depth of the young nurse's character, showing that her compassionate nature not only remained intact, but intensified when confronted with circumstances that demanded the very best of the human condition. Thomas understood that Evelyn had turned medicine into a vocation that transcended professional protocols, becoming a personal guardian of every life entrusted to her care. Frank Dawson floated in an altered state of consciousness that combined mental clarity with physical detachment, allowing him to observe the situation with the analytical objectivity of a historian, documenting events he knew were extraordinary. The sergeant had become a privileged witness to a demonstration of medical competence that surpassed anything military manuals could describe, a performance of silent heroism carried out without an audience and without any expectation of official recognition. The rough texture of the bandages against his wounded skin worked as a sensory anchor, keeping him connected to immediate reality, preventing the morphine from carrying him into unconsciousness and robbing him of the chance to mentally record what he was witnessing. Frank understood that Thomas and Evelyn were fighting a parallel war, in which the weapons were surgical instruments, and the battlefield was the shattered human body. Yet the intensity of combat was just as fierce, and the personal risks just as deadly as any direct engagement with the enemy. The seasoned soldier recognized that medical courage required a special kind of bravery, the ability to maintain absolute technical precision while bombs explode nearby, knowing that any tremor of the hands or lapse of concentration could cost an American life that might be saved through professional competence under extreme pressure. The morphine sharpened his emotional perception, even as it eased physical pain, creating a strange mental clarity that allowed him to catch nuances of dedication that casual observation would miss, like the way Thomas discreetly checked each patient's condition, even while fully absorbed in complex procedures. Frank Dawson knew he was witnessing something history books rarely grant due weight, the human dimension of war, where final victory depends as much on those who heal as on those who fight. The sergeant from Iowa had learned that there are many ways to serve one's country, and some of the most crucial occur behind the scenes of the conflict, carried out by individuals whose heroism is expressed through the application of technical knowledge under conditions that would test anyone's psychological limits. The war was revealing aspects of human nature that conventional military experience could not teach, the capacity to transcend personal limitations when motivated by a sense of responsibility that reaches beyond self-preservation. The morning bombardment came with tactical coordination that indicated the Germans had specifically identified the aid station as a strategic target, a violation of international conventions that had become common in the Nazis' desperate resistance to the Allied invasion. Thomas grasped immediately that this time they faced a systematic attack designed to eliminate American medical capabilities, forcing him to make decisions no doctor should ever have to face, choosing which lives could be saved in the time remaining before German bombs made any treatment impossible. The first explosion was calculated to strike the post's main entrance, blocking the evacuation route and turning the place into a death trap where patients and doctors were equally vulnerable to enemy fire. Thomas was performing emergency surgery to remove shrapnel from the heart of a sergeant from Virginia, a procedure requiring absolute concentration and perfectly steady hands, when he realized that to continue meant staking his own life on his ability to finish before the next barrage destroyed the building entirely. The American doctor looked into Evelyn's eyes and saw the same desperate calculation he was making. Both knew that fleeing would condemn soldiers with real chances of survival to death, but staying meant accepting the possibility of dying while trying to save them. The acrid stench of German powder flooded the medical space with suffocating intensity, mingling with the familiar odors of disinfectant and blood, to form an atmosphere that perfectly symbolized the conflict between destruction and healing that defined their situation. Frank Dawson watched that critical moment of decision and understood he was witnessing the ultimate test of Thomas and Evelyn's character, the choice between personal safety and medical duty when the two could not coexist. The second explosion was even closer, cracking what walls remained and sending surgical instruments flying across the room. Yet Thomas did not stop the procedure he was performing on the wounded soldier's heart. Evelyn continued administering anesthesia with the same precision she would bring to a peaceful operating room, showing that they had consciously chosen to accept personal risk in the name of their medical responsibilities. The third explosion turned what was left of the ceiling into rubble, opening a gap through which the gray light of the Norman sky mixed with flames beginning to lick the wooden framework of the old French school. Thomas completed the removal of the shrapnel from the Virginia sergeant's heart amid a constant rain of debris, and the sound of the heartbeat returning to normal was almost inaudible within the roar of the blasts. Yet it marked a medical victory, achieved literally under direct enemy fire. Evelyn immediately shifted her attention to the next critical case, a corporal from Texas whose abdominal wounds demanded immediate surgical intervention, demonstrating the instant transition between emergencies that defined the best wartime medical professionals operating under maximum pressure. The British nurse had developed an efficiency that transcended formal training, anticipating medical needs through an intuition honed by the intensive experience of saving lives under impossible conditions. Immobilized but fully conscious, Frank Dawson watched that display of medical competence executed, while the building literally collapsed around them, and understood he was witnessing heroism in its purest form, the absolute refusal to abandon professional responsibilities even when death became an immediate possibility. The wounded soldier realized that Thomas and Evelyn had consciously chosen to prioritize their medical obligations over their own safety, turning medicine into a form of resistance against forces seeking to destroy both human life and the values that sustain it. The rough texture of the dressings against his wounded skin reminded him constantly of life's physical fragility, but the team's unshakable determination made him believe in the human spirit's capacity to transcend limitations when motivated by purposes beyond self-preservation. Thomas began the next surgical procedure as flames began to lick at the edges of the improvised operating room, and Frank Dawson knew he was witnessing medicine practiced under conditions that completely redefined the meaning of professional courage. The war had turned those doctors into a different kind of warrior, fighters against death, wielding instruments of healing rather than weapons of destruction, risking their own lives to preserve those of strangers who had become their sacred responsibility. True wartime medicine happens when you consciously choose to save lives knowing that choice may cost your own. It is heroism practiced at the intersection of technical competence and personal sacrifice. The morning of the third day brought a strange calm that made Thomas Greer realize the Germans were regrouping for a final attack on American medical positions, a sinister pause that allowed an assessment of the accumulated devastation and preparations for what promised to be the ultimate test of his endurance. The forward aid station now functioned under conditions that transcended any conventional definition of a field hospital. Collapsed walls, a partially fallen roof, damaged equipment, yet still fulfilling its essential purpose of preserving American lives flowing in constantly from the front lines. The smell of smoke mixed with the familiar odors of disinfectant and blood had become the permanent olfactory signature of that space where medicine operated beyond all reasonable limits, sustained only by the unshakable determination of professionals who had turned their work into a transcendent mission. Thomas examined his own hands, trembling from accumulated exhaustion, cut by shrapnel, stained with the blood of dozens of soldiers, and realized they had become specialized instruments for saving lives under circumstances no medical schooling could ever adequately simulate. The war had revealed capacities he hadn't known he possessed, turning him into a doctor able to function with surgical precision, even as bombardments made the ground quake beneath his feet and shrapnel sliced the air around the operating table. Evelyn organized the remaining medical supplies with the efficiency of a general readying troops for a decisive battle, and Thomas noticed she had developed the ability to assess available resources and calculate how many lives could be saved with what was left. The American doctor understood that both of them were consciously preparing for a situation in which they would have to choose which soldiers received treatment and which would be left to their fate, a decision no doctor should be forced to make, but one the war had made inevitable. From his cot, Frank Dawson recognized the signs of preparation for a decisive fight, but he saw that Thomas and Evelyn armed themselves with surgical instruments instead of rifles, preparing to battle death rather than inflict more destruction. The temporary lull allowed the wounded sergeant to process mentally all he had witnessed, a sustained display of medical heroism that redefined his understanding of the different forms courage can take during human conflict. Evelyn Carter used the pause in shelling to personally check the condition of every wounded soldier under her care, moving among the improvised cots with the maternal attentiveness of someone who regarded each patient as a non-transferable personal responsibility. The British nurse had developed a professional intimacy with suffering that allowed her to assess each wound's progress through subtle signs that would escape less experienced practitioners of wartime medicine. Evelyn had learned to read facial expressions, tones of groans, and breathing patterns the way a veteran physician reads lab results, developing a diagnostic intuition that compensated for the lack of sophisticated equipment through intensified human observation. Her blonde hair, now permanently disheveled and speckled with dust and dried blood, framed a face that reflected 72 hours of constant tension, yet her blue eyes maintained the same compassionate intensity that had characterized her work from the first day. The young woman knew she was operating far beyond any limit she would have considered possible before the war, discovering reserves of physical and emotional endurance that only extreme circumstances can fully mobilize. Thomas watched Evelyn whisper personalized words of encouragement to soldiers who might not survive the next bombardment, and understood that she had turned each medical interaction into an act of love, applied under conditions that would test anyone's humanity. The nurse had developed the capacity to offer realistic hope without creating false illusions, calibrating her words of comfort according to the actual prognosis of each individual case. Frank Dawson noticed that Evelyn had memorized not only the names of all the wounded, but personal details about their families, hometowns, and dreams interrupted by war. Information she used to personalize medical care in a way that transcended conventional professional protocols. The war was revealing that true nursing involves much more than technical competence. It demands an emotional dedication that turns every patient into a personal cause worthy of whatever sacrifice is necessary. Thomas realized that Evelyn had found in wartime medicine a vocation that allowed her to fully express her compassionate nature, transforming destructive circumstances into opportunities to exercise the purest form of human care. The young British nurse had discovered that the war, for all its brutality, created spaces where authentic compassion could operate at maximum intensity, uncorrupted by hospital bureaucracy or administrative limits that often interfere with ideal medical care. Frank Dawson used those moments of relative calm to mentally process the extraordinary display of medical competence he had witnessed over 3 uninterrupted days, understanding that he had seen something that would forever change his understanding of heroism, professional dedication, and human resilience under extreme pressure. The sergeant had spent 72 hours immobilized on that cot, turned into a privileged observer of a performance of wartime medicine that surpassed anything official military reports could hope to describe. The familiar texture of the bandages against his wounded skin served as a constant reminder of the fragility of human life, but the steadfast presence of Thomas and Evelyn made him believe in the human spirit's ability to withstand the harshest circumstances through the application of technical knowledge motivated by authentic compassion. Frank understood he had witnessed a war within the war, where American and British medics fought German death using surgical instruments as weapons and medical knowledge as ammunition, waging microscopic battles in every wounded body that arrived at the forward post. The seasoned soldier recognized that Thomas and Evelyn had displayed a kind of courage military manuals cannot properly classify, the quiet bravery of continuing to function with maximum precision while bombs explode nearby, knowing that any technical failure would cost lives that might be saved through professional competence under impossible conditions. The morphine had produced a strange mental clarity that allowed him to analyze what he was seeing with objectivity, like a theater critic watching a performance about life and death carried out by actors risking their own lives to keep the show going. Frank Dawson knew he would forever carry the memory of those medics who turned medicine into a form of resistance against destructive forces, proving that war reveals both the worst and the best of human nature, often simultaneously. The sergeant from Iowa had learned that there are multiple ways to serve one's country during military conflict, and some of the most crucial involve saving lives rather than taking them, healing wounds rather than causing them, offering hope rather than spreading terror. The war was teaching him that final victory would depend as much on the ability to destroy the enemy as on the skill to preserve wounded Allied soldiers, and that both functions required different but equally valid forms of professional heroism. Frank watched Thomas and Evelyn prepare for what he sensed would be the ultimate test of their endurance, and he thought that over 3 days he had witnessed a sustained demonstration of everything humanity possesses that is most noble when confronted with circumstances that demand the very best of its essential nature. The final German assault was announced by the coordinated roar of multiple artillery batteries, a symphony of destruction that made Thomas immediately understand they now faced a systematic bombardment designed specifically to eliminate any American medical capability in the Normandy sector. The first volley was calculated to create a ring of explosions around the aid station, isolating it completely and turning it into a death trap where doctors and patients were equally vulnerable to the concentrated fire to follow. Thomas was in the middle of emergency heart surgery on a lieutenant from the 82nd Airborne, whose wound demanded absolutely steady hands and total concentration, when he realized he had roughly 10 minutes to save that life before German bombs made any medical treatment completely impossible. The American doctor looked at Evelyn and saw in her blue eyes the same iron determination he felt. Both had consciously decided they would keep operating until the very last possible second, prioritizing their medical responsibilities over any consideration of personal safety the situation might suggest. The intense smell of German powder flooded the room with suffocating density, mingling with the familiar odors of antiseptic and blood to create an atmosphere that perfectly symbolized the battle between construction and destruction defining that extreme situation. Frank Dawson watched that decisive moment and understood he was witnessing the final choice that would forever define the character of Thomas and Evelyn, continuing to save lives knowing that decision would likely cost their own. The second volley was even more precise, striking the building's east wing directly and making the entire structure shudder violently. Yet Thomas did not hesitate to continue the delicate procedure he was performing on the wounded officer's heart. Evelyn kept the anesthesia running with the same precision she would apply in a perfectly equipped operating room, showing that both had completely transcended any instinct for self-preservation in the name of their sacred professional obligations. The sound of surgical instruments working amid the thunder of explosions created a strange melody that contrasted the precision of medicine with the brutality of war, symbolizing organized life's resistance against the forces of destructive chaos. The final blast was direct and devastating, turning what remained of the medical post into smoldering rubble, but Thomas managed to complete the cardiac surgery seconds before impact, saving the life of the 82nd Airborne Lieutenant in one of the last medical acts performed in that destroyed facility. The sound of the heart returning to a normal rhythm was drowned by the deafening roar of the collapse, yet it represented a final medical victory, achieved literally at the last possible moment, before German death claimed that contested ground. Evelyn managed to administer morphine to 3 wounded soldiers in the final seconds before total destruction, offering relief from pain, even as she knew there might not be time for more complex procedures that could save their lives. The British nurse and the American doctor looked at each other one last time amid the falling debris, and Frank Dawson perceived that both felt a profound satisfaction for having upheld their medical responsibilities to the absolute end of their physical capacities. The wounded sergeant, partially shielded by rubble that formed an improvised shelter around his cot, watched Thomas and Evelyn continue providing medical care even after the building had almost completely collapsed on top of them. The rough texture of debris mixed with blood created a paste that clung to everything, but it could not diminish the resolve of those medics who had turned resistance to destruction into an art practiced with surgical instruments and technical knowledge, applied under the most adverse conditions imaginable. Frank Dawson understood in that moment that he had witnessed authentic heroism in its purest form, the absolute refusal to abandon sacred responsibilities, even when that choice meant consciously accepting mortal risk. The war had revealed the true character of Thomas and Evelyn, showing that some people possess inner reserves of courage and dedication that transcend any consideration of personal safety when confronted with situations demanding the best of their essential human nature. Thomas and Evelyn kept working amid the smoldering ruins, saving the last lives they could reach before Allied rescue troops arrived to evacuate survivors from that extraordinary demonstration of medicine practiced beyond every reasonable limit of human endurance. Medical heroism reaches its purest form when a life is saved at the last possible second. It is medicine practiced on the absolute frontier between technical competence and supreme sacrifice. 3 weeks after the final bombardment, Thomas Greer found himself in a field hospital, set up in an old French abbey, where he could finally mentally process the extraordinary experience he had lived through at the Normandy Forward Aid Station, understanding that those days had forever transformed his grasp of medicine, courage, and the profound meaning of the vocation to heal under extreme circumstances. The American doctor discovered that war had revealed capacities he hadn't known he possessed, turning him into a professional able to function with surgical precision even when bombs made the world explode around him. But he had also learned that technical competence without authentic compassion remains inadequate to confront human suffering in its most intense form. The familiar smell of hospital disinfectant, now without the constant mix of gunpowder and blood that had defined the days at the forward post, felt strangely artificial, as if medicine practiced under ideal conditions were somehow less real than that performed under direct enemy fire. Thomas adjusted dressings on wounded soldiers evacuated from the front lines, and noticed that his hands retained the steadiness developed during those 72 uninterrupted hours of surgery under bombardment, but that his medical approach had acquired an emotional dimension formal education could never adequately teach. War had taught him that true medicine happens when technical knowledge combines with full human presence, where each procedure becomes an act of resistance against forces bent on destroying both life and the values that sustain it. Evelyn worked in the nursing ward with the same total dedication she had shown at the forward post, but Thomas sensed she had developed a special capacity to offer hope, calibrated by realism, never creating false illusions yet always finding genuine grounds for optimism even in the most challenging cases. The American doctor understood that both of them had been changed by the experience of practicing medicine beyond all conventional limits, discovering that the act of saving lives under impossible conditions had forged a professional bond that transcended nationalities, hospital protocols, and even significant cultural differences. Frank Dawson, now recovered enough to walk with crutches, visited regularly the medical team that had saved his life, carrying with him the living memory of all he had witnessed during those extraordinary 3 days at the Normandy forward post. The sergeant had become a kind of unofficial chronicler of that display of medical heroism, telling other wounded soldiers stories of medics who risked their own lives to preserve those of strangers who had become their sacred responsibility. Evelyn Carter had found that the forward post experience had transformed her approach to nursing in ways she was still fully processing, revealing dimensions of the medical profession her studies in London could never have simulated or adequately prepared her for. The British nurse had learned that authentic technical competence must be accompanied by an emotional presence that turns every medical interaction into a meaningful human encounter, where healing physical wounds becomes inseparable from providing whole-person care to the one who suffers. Evelyn now worked with an efficiency that incorporated all she had learned about medical improvisation under adverse conditions, but also with a heightened sensitivity to the emotional needs of soldiers facing not only physical pain, but psychological terror, homesickness, uncertainty about the future, and deep questions about the meaning of their participation in the war. Her blonde hair, now neatly kept under a regulation nurse's cap, could not entirely conceal the changes the war had wrought in her character. A new seriousness mixed with a deeper compassion, as though she had discovered reserves of emotional strength she hadn't known she possessed. The young woman knew she had been tested beyond any limit she had considered possible before the war, discovering that true nursing requires not only technical knowledge, but the courage to remain present with human suffering, even when that presence causes significant personal pain. Thomas watched Evelyn work with wounded soldiers and saw that she had developed a diagnostic intuition that operated through intensified human observation, able to detect shifts in patients' physical and emotional states through subtle signs that would escape the notice of practitioners less experienced in wartime medicine. The nurse crafted personalized conversations with each soldier, memorizing details about their families, their aspirations interrupted by war, their specific fears, and their particular sources of hope, turning medical care into an art that fused technical competence with whole-person attention. Frank Dawson noticed that Evelyn had become a kind of unofficial confessor for soldiers who needed to process traumatic experiences, offering a safe space where they could express vulnerabilities military codes did not allow them to reveal in other contexts. The war had taught the young nurse that to truly heal means attending to the complete needs of the human being, not merely treating physical symptoms in isolation, but recognizing that bodily injuries often mirror emotional and spiritual wounds that also require specialized clinical attention. Thomas sensed that Evelyn had found in wartime medicine a vocation that let her fully express her compassionate nature, discovering that extreme circumstances created opportunities to practice human care in its purest and most necessary form, unconstrained by hospital bureaucracy or administrative protocols that so often interfere with the direct relationship between clinician and patient. Frank Dawson had become the unofficial historian of that extraordinary experience, dedicating himself to mentally recording every detail of the display of medical competence he had witnessed, understanding that he had seen something that ought to be preserved and passed on to future generations of soldiers and medical professionals. The sergeant used his recovery periods to write detailed letters to his family in Iowa, describing not only his own combat experiences, but especially the 3 days he spent watching Thomas and Evelyn save lives under constant bombardment, recognizing that he had witnessed a form of heroism rarely given proper recognition in the official records of war. Frank had learned that there are multiple dimensions of military conflict. Conventional tactical reports cannot adequately capture the war waged by doctors against death, the silent battles fought in every wounded body, the microscopic victories won through the application of technical knowledge under conditions that test the absolute limits of human endurance. The experience had transformed his understanding of courage, showing him that authentic bravery often operates far from the spotlight, practiced by professionals whose only reward is the intimate satisfaction of knowing they returned wounded soldiers to their families through competence, exercised under significant personal risk. The soldier from Iowa discovered that war reveals both the worst and the best of human nature, and that these revelations often occur simultaneously in the same physical space as doctors save lives while bombs explode around them, proving that humanity's capacity to resist chaos through organization, knowledge, and compassion surpasses any destructive force that can be mobilized against it. Frank began seeking out other wounded soldiers treated by Thomas and Evelyn, collecting testimonies that confirmed his own observations about the exceptional character of those medical professionals who had turned medicine into a performance art practiced under impossible conditions. The sergeant understood that he had witnessed something that would forever change his comprehension of what it means to serve one's country in war, learning that some of the most crucial contributions to final victory occur through acts of preservation rather than destruction, healing instead of wounding, hope instead of terror. Frank Dawson knew he would carry that memory as a personal treasure, a reminder that humanity possesses reserves of resilience and compassion that no external force can exhaust, demonstrated by ordinary people who discover extraordinary capacities when confronted with situations that demand the very best of their essential nature. The war was teaching him that true heroism often happens in silence, practiced by individuals who risk their own lives to preserve those of others, turning technical knowledge into instruments of resistance against forces that seek to destroy both life and the civilizational values that sustain and give it meaning. The chance reunion of Thomas, Evelyn, and Frank came 6 months later at a military hospital in liberated Paris, where the three discovered they had been permanently transformed by the experience they had shared at the Normandy forward post, creating bonds that transcended military hierarchies, nationalities, and significant social differences. Thomas now worked as a medical consultant for field hospitals across the European front, applying the emergency medicine techniques he had developed during those critical 3 days, but above all, teaching other professionals the importance of maintaining full human presence even when extreme circumstances push toward purely technical, depersonalized treatments. The American doctor discovered that his experience at the forward post had become a constant reference point for evaluating every other medical situation he faced, establishing a standard of professional excellence that combined maximum technical competence with compassion applied under any circumstance, regardless of personal risk or logistical difficulty. Evelyn had been transferred to a hospital specializing in complex war trauma, where her experience with improvised medicine and her ability to provide whole-person care were especially valued by medical commanders who recognized the exceptional quality of her work. The British nurse had developed a reputation among wounded soldiers as someone able to offer not only technical competence, but a human presence that turned medical treatment into something that restored personal dignity rather than merely repairing physical damage. Frank had been promoted and assigned to medical evacuation, a role that allowed him to apply his intimate understanding of the specific needs of wounded soldiers and the special capacities required of medical professionals operating under active combat conditions. The sergeant used his position to make sure exceptional doctors and nurses like Thomas and Evelyn received the resources they needed to keep saving lives, becoming a kind of unofficial advocate for field medicine, executed to the highest standards of professional excellence. The three discovered they shared a common language forged during those days at the forward post, a mutual understanding of what it means to function beyond conventional limits when human lives depend on that transcendence of normal constraints. Thomas, Evelyn, and Frank recognized in one another a special quality the war had revealed: the capacity to discover unexpected reserves of endurance, competence, and compassion when confronted with situations that demand the best of human nature, turning potentially destructive experiences into opportunities for significant personal and professional growth. Their conversation that Parisian afternoon revealed that each had processed the forward post experience differently, but all agreed those 3 days had set a standard of personal excellence that would continue to shape their lives long after the war ended. Thomas confessed he often wondered whether he could maintain the same level of medical dedication when he returned to peacetime practice, worrying that the absence of life or death urgency might diminish his professional motivation or temper the intensity of his commitment to each individual patient. Evelyn admitted she had discovered a vocation that transcended conventional nursing, understanding that her true aptitude involved providing whole-person care in situations where technical competence must be combined with personal courage and total emotional presence, qualities civilian hospitals rarely demand or properly value. Frank explained that he had become a kind of unofficial advocate for wartime medicine, working to ensure that lessons learned in experiences like the forward post would be preserved and passed on to future generations of military medical professionals who would face similar challenges in conflicts to come. The three found they shared a deep understanding of the transformative nature of extreme experiences, recognizing that situations testing the absolute limits of human endurance also reveal capacities hidden during ordinary life, creating opportunities for personal growth unavailable by other means. Thomas, Evelyn, and Frank agreed that the war had been simultaneously the most destructive and most revealing experience of their lives, forcing them to discover aspects of themselves they hadn't known, while also creating permanent responsibilities to apply those discoveries in ways that honor the sacrifice of those who did not survive. The Paris afternoon allowed them to collectively process memories they had carried individually for months, understanding they had participated in something that transcended their personal experiences, a demonstration of everything humanity possesses that is most noble when confronted with circumstances demanding the best of its essential nature. The three recognized they would remain connected forever by the experience shared at the forward post, not only as professional colleagues, but as mutual witnesses to a transformation that had revealed the human potential to transcend limitations through the application of knowledge, compassion, and courage, under conditions that test the absolute limits of what we consider possible when driven by responsibilities beyond self-preservation and personal comfort. War reveals forms of heroism that operate in silence, practiced by people who risk everything to preserve life. And these are the victories that truly matter when history is told in full.